Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm sure you're all dreaming of a lovely cocktail by now, and your brains are probably buzzing with all the great presentations you've seen earlier. So thank you very much. Just very briefly, my name is Natalie Milinovic. I work at the BBC, and I'm involved in all things mobile. We have an incredible topic today, which is why you're all here, is, will there be journalists in 2030? And we have an absolutely brilliant panel to discuss this. There are no presentations. This will be a conversation despite this format. So I'll start with some brief introductions. We've got Gavin Sheridan here, who's the co-founder of Viz Legal, also has an NGO dedicated to FOI, and used to work at Storyful, and has done a lot of investigative journalism. Next, Janine, editor-in-chief, BuzzFeed, formerly from The Guardian, and the woman who brought us the Snowden revelations. George, who is the mastermind behind this panel, whose idea it was, a professor of journalism at City University, and an illustrious career as a newspaper journalist and editor, mainly at The Times. And finally, Mark Bunting, who is currently looking at regulation of platforms at the Oxford Internet Institute, is that right? Does some consulting and has long experience as doing strategy for the BBC, Ofcom, and others. So, before we start, I thought I'd just work out how many people in the room think there will be journalists in 2030. Just show your hands. Quite optimistic. How many think there won't be any? I'm talking professional journalists. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, not many. Let's see if we can change your minds after this. Okay. So, we are going to talk about the profession of journalism and not business models, but I'm going to let George start because this was his idea. So he has a few things to say.
Do I need something here? Yeah, I do. Thank you. I think I'm the oldest, in fact, I'm certain I'm the oldest member of this panel, so I've actually posed a question about 2030 that I may very well not be around to see the answer to on schedule. In the context of Trump and Brexit and the kind of bounce that has given people whose subscribers' numbers are going up, the New York Times, for example, and so on, we might be tempted to think that journalism is going to be now, as a result of this, okay. It just struck me in the run-up to this conference that actually the problem of disintermediation, remember that? The problem of disintermediation hasn't actually gone away. And I've always asked myself whether the historians of 2030, or maybe better, 2130, will say to each other, wasn't it odd? In 2017, they had a separate professional class whose self-appointed job was to tell people about what they couldn't see and hear with their own eyes and ears. Wasn't that weird? Because it could be a real question in the future. And I'm not going to say we can only hope, nor am I going to start a debate about the business models for journalism, because I have lived through too many of those. I want to ask a different question. What is it that journalists have to do to entrench the belief in the value of journalism and what they do? I think that's the key to the survival of the idea of journalism. I think it will be around as an idea in 2030. I think there will be journalists in 2030, but I can understand anybody asking. And I'm going to quickly say 3 things that I think are important to the entrenching that I would like to see. I think journalists are going to have to think much, much wider than journalism about the rebuilding of civil societies. I said a little bit about this in this room, not as a member of a panel this morning, but the space, creating and keeping safe the space for agreeing what is true, is not just a business of journalism, although it is very important to journalists, and journalists can contribute to it. It's a social, cultural, legal, institutional thing. And I think it's a really, really big task. Second point, I think some humility about the value of journalism is a very good idea. If people are now dealing with, in their daily lives, 4, 5, 20, 30 times more information than they would have had 20 years ago, the perceived value of all information is bound to fall. Get over it. It's just a new condition of life. And the third thing I would recommend is agility. In the late 20th century, we had a period in journalism in which income for print and terrestrial television was very solid and relatively assured. It convinced an entire generation of journalists, my generation roughly speaking, that all this would continue, it would roll forward on wheels indefinitely. That is historically complete nonsense. Every other era of journalism has been improvisational, volatile, risky, and littered with the wrecks of projects that don't work. So we have to get used to threats coming at us. It might be artificial intelligence, it might be virtual reality, it might be ad blockers, it might be anything. They will come at us in a regular stream. Get over it. We have to be more sensitive about connecting supply to demand, more sensitive and adaptable. And I think we have to be better at showing the origins of what we do. One of the problems about digital, it's been come up in many, many panels here, is that it's very difficult to see the true origins of the information on which you are relying. I'm involved in a project called Inject, ask me if you're interested, which allows reporters to do that rather better. Those are my three very modest proposals for entrenching belief, and I've already overrun my time, I'm sure, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. And by the way, we want this to be a conversation, so if anyone has questions, just raise your hand and wave a lot, because I'm short-sighted, so we'll get a mic to you. You know, there's been a lot of talk at this conference about fake news. Why don't we start there and get it done with? How about that? For now, at least. You know, fake news is a huge problem, which we are all talking about, but it's also mooted by some as a saviour of journalism, as in that's why we need journalists. I want to start with Mark about who you're looking into regulation. You've mentioned to me Germany before, who passed this new law about information online. Do you want to talk about how you see that? Do you think that is one of the answers to it?
Thank you, Natalie, and George and I were just talking about this. So I think there is, for me, a rather worrying trend in the policy debate about this that says that traditional journalism, traditional journalistic organisations need the protection of the state in order to fulfil the functions that societies historically look to them to fulfil. I think there are some things that policymakers could look at, but I'm quite worried about the trends that we're seeing towards more repressive forms of government action on provision of information. And the law that you mentioned, Natalie, in Germany, I think is a good example. For those who don't know the background, essentially the proposal is that Germany would require social platforms to remove illegal content or risk a fine. They would have 24 hours in which to do it, unless it's a really complicated case, in which case they can have a whole week to think about it. And the sanction is a fine of up to 50 million euros. And I think what this particular episode is revealing is that policymakers are always very keen to feel that they've demonstrated that they've solved a problem by passing a law. But actually what happens is they don't solve the problem, they merely delegate the problem to a third party, in this case to digital platforms. And we've seen in a number of areas already that the effect of that is not really to protect journalism, it's merely to sort of export the power for controlling the flow of information to a third party with then relatively little visibility of the impact of that policy. So if you look at the area of copyright takedown requests, for example, where the platforms are similarly under a requirement to take down material that's notified to them. Google now gets something in the order of 20 million copyright takedown requests every month. That's about 100,000 every single hour, the vast majority of which it complies with. I've got no idea whether Google deploys that policy effectively or not, but I'm pretty confident that they're not looking carefully at every 100,000 of those incidences of alleged copyright infringement and making a carefully balanced judgment about whether or not the material was in fact illegally infringing copyright. And I think that these moves by policymakers to appear to have solved a problem by passing responsibility for it over to the platforms is very problematic. And I think what we'll see in the German case is not a sort of flowering of conditions in which positive journalism can thrive, but more a kind of transition to a rather opaque system in which Google and Facebook are deciding what's illegal material and what isn't, and the rest of us have relatively little visibility or control over that. So I'm quite worried about regulatory solutions to so-called fake news.
Some of the other solutions have been obviously around, how you signal to people that something is trustworthy, it comes from a good source. And the question that raises for me is actually whether audiences really care. So obviously, every outlet has its dedicated audience and loyal audience, but what about the wider population? I don't know, Janine, I mean, you're supposed to be closer to your audience than other organisations. You understand them better. It's part of your success. What do you think they actually care, whether it comes from a journalist or not, or who wrote it, or a reputable organisation?
So I was trying to answer this terrifying essay question by breaking it down into logical constituent parts, which is obviously completely the wrong way to try and answer it, and actually you should just go for the big picture. But if 2030 is 13 years from now, and I think it is, I've obviously been in journalism longer than 13 years. So, and I can remember when journalism involved not really having internet access and going into a newsroom and doing some typing. So I thought, what is the read across for the people that work for BuzzFeed? I'm obviously considerably older than most of the people that work for BuzzFeed. Most of the people that work for BuzzFeed are of an age and in the generation of their audience. What will they be doing when they are my advanced years? And it seems to me that one of the things they are already doing is disintermediating or disaggregating from their own publication. This generation of creators and therefore readers and viewers and interactors does not get up in the morning and think, I want to get the splash, clearly. They don't even think about where their story is going to be, on which device or on which platform. Increasingly, not even on BuzzFeed, the website. Just, I'm going to make some content today, and that content will reach this audience, and this will be the way that I'm going to tell this story. And that applies to everything from the Buzz end of things to BuzzFeed News and the sort of huge investigations. So if you think across a sort of 20-year time frame, and I can remember the things, obviously, that we did with the typing, the skills don't really disappear. I mean, for a start, you still do typing, but the things that you do in order to produce some content, you identify something interesting, try and find something that has a read-through to the people that you're trying to reach, try and find the common ground, we call it the relatability, the frame that you're going to put this story into, and then find the fastest, most effective or richest or deepest way to do it. Our skills are still all there. We probably separate them out a lot more than we used to. When, we used to sort of package everything, and now we disintermediate it and put it out on different platforms. But effectively, the things we do are still the same. We adapt and flex whether we're going to do an illustration or a piece of video. We change a headline into a deck or some keywords. But the skills that we're using are all still the same.
And you think the same skills will be there in 2030, or will be necessary even?
I think... So what I think is there's going to be, because there always is, as technology changes journalism, a continuum between things that are automated and things that are highly bespoke. So you have your sort of machine-created tasks, and then you have your very artisanal tasks. So the things that we know, and this is where you can tie the fake news debate, I suppose, into our essay question. There are things that humans do better than machines. Identifying whether or not the story is true is clearly one of them. And digging deeper to make something richer and more powerful and have more impact and change the world is clearly something that a human does better than a machine. However, there will always be, or increasingly, be things that the machine does more effectively in distribution terms. So somewhere in that scale is both the hope and the misery, depending on the fashion. About 10 years ago, when I first started editing things for digital, there were never going to be any more editors. Editors were doomed. The editors had about 5 minutes. I think probably Jeff Jarvis came and told us that once. But it was all going to be curation, and we had to, go find the story. But the reader would be the editor and then share it all out. I think that's tipped again. And we might find ourselves in a new era of coming up with new words for citizen journalists or people that are on the ground and find things out and show them to you, and we have to hand pick the good ones rather than select them automatically, because automagic isn't working so well. Something like that. Yes.
I'd echo a lot of what Janine said.
Oh, thank God.
And I think it's interesting that there's the question that's posed for the session is, will there be journalists in 2030 rather than will there be journalism in 2030? So it's more people centered. My answer to that is, I think yes, but I think there might be less of them. Sorry to break that to any potential future journalists. I think one of the philosophies that I would take from the question is, where were we 13 years ago instead of 13 years hence? In 2004, I was 2 years blogging. YouTube didn't really exist as a phenomenon. Facebook was just being invented. Twitter had not appeared yet. It was still kind of the early days of when blogging was becoming a sexy thing in 2004. And the means of distribution were still quite loose in terms of blogs. It was like you found blogs through the links from other blogs, and that was kind of it. Or you use a service called Technorati, which is, I think, long since gone, or maybe still around. When you're thinking about 13 years in the future, I'm kind of thinking, well, journalism for me, and this was a philosophy we had in Storyful as well, it's a three-step process in my head, or I tried to break it down, as Janine said, into its kind of constituent parts. One is gathering information, one is actioning or analysing information, and the third is the distribution of the results of the process. And I break down most processes in journalism into those three buckets. Storyful was, in essence, a news-gathering company, and it kind of still is. Its main focus is gathering information in a systematic way, and then giving that information over to other newsrooms. It doesn't give it necessarily to the audience directly. And that's the area that most interests me, because it goes to the core of what the action of a journalist is at its core, which is the first step in the process. The first step in the process for me when I'm trying to do a story is sometimes it's a tip-off, sometimes it's an FOI, sometimes it's a database, sometimes it's something I read somewhere and then I join a dot with something else in my head. I think that process is really, really inefficient in most newsrooms that I've seen, and from most journalists I speak to, I think that process could be an awful lot better. The problem that might generate is that we might try to automate it. And certainly that's what my philosophy is, that we try to automate that manual process as much as possible. And I think the opportunities for building automation within this are quite big. The second thing that comes from that automation or task of automation is having a philosophy of A, making money, and B, building products, right? And that's something that still, I started in Storyful in 2010, right at the start. That's now 7 years ago, or half the time of this session, so half the time between now and 2030. A lot of water under the bridge since then. And I think still newsrooms have not fully embraced how we systemize and automate as much of the tasks that we have as possible. Because, echoing what Janine said as well, human brains are really good at doing certain things that machines will take a long time to figure out how to do. But also machines should be doing as much as possible of the heavy lifting, so that we can focus on the things that we do well. And certainly with the company I'm running at the moment, that's our entire objective, is to gather and systemize legal information, because we see a connection between systemizing and structuring legal information and tying that directly to a customer, into a business that you sell a product to. And I try to drill this into, when I'm having frequent numbers of pints with many journalists all the time, I try to instill this idea that we kind of have to start with the principle of making money and paying our mortgages. I think if I was looking at newsrooms generally today, I was thinking about this in the last session. The New York Times said we've increased our number of subscribers since Trump was elected, I think by 200,000. That's $40 a month times 200,000. My question is, have we already kind of solved this in a way? The New York Times has 3,500 staff, I think. But did those 200,000 people subscribe to the New York Times post-Trump? specifically for the Washington-based team, the data team, and the investigations team. And I think that their salaries are probably reasonably well paid by those 200,000 new subscribers if you were to look at it solely through that perspective. Because tying the relationship between somebody subscribing to what you're offering and your product without any advertising necessarily in the mix, I think is one of the biggest opportunities for a lot of news organizations. That we don't necessarily need to rely on advertisers either. And when you're looking towards 2030, I think that model of automating as much as we can, let the machines do what they can well, and build good products that people want to buy, along with, when you are selling a product, possibly subscriptions and SaaS-based businesses, including reporting, it might be a way to, pay your mortgage. Because every investigative journalist I've ever met is not interested in building multi-million-euro businesses. They're interested in paying their mortgage and hunting stories. Once their mortgage is paid and they can pay the bills, they're pretty happy.
So I think we're all kind of agreed there will be journalists of some kind in 2030. George, you're responsible for teaching a new generation who probably, if we do have editors in 2030, will be the editors by then, or will be in charge of media organizations. Is there anything different in how they're being prepared? Are they prepared for this?
I think they are prepared for it. They're much more resilient and optimistic than the older generation. That's the first thing to be said. I think they are learning new navigational skills. I'm impressed by the confidence that both Gavin and Janine have about the traditional gathering, processing, and distributing process. What I'm worried about, or what I can't quite overcome my fear about, is whether everyone other than journalists understands that that is valuable, if you see what I mean. If they don't understand it's valuable, we can go on doing that process, let's call it storytelling for short, till we're blue in the face. But either people aren't going to believe it, or they're not going to buy it, or worst of all, both.
Well, so it won't exist if they don't.
We do discuss this a lot with students. They're, like I say, they're optimists. They're resilient optimists. And they're coming in increasingly large numbers, particularly to the university where I teach part-time, from this country.
Okay, so are there any questions? It would be particularly good to hear from someone who doesn't believe there will be journalists in 2030. Anyone volunteer an opinion on a question? No?
We've answered all the
Go on, the odd hand did go up.
Okay, people who do think there will be journalists in 2030, any questions, or should we just continue?
Yeah.
There's a question over there. Can you wait till you get a microphone? Thank you.
Hi. I'm taught at this school for journalism, and one of the things we get taught is that a way to get more viewers or subscribers to yourself is building community. And I was wondering what your opinions about that is. Should we build or think more about community and building around that to get more subscribers?
Do you want to take that?
I would say definitely. One of the things that I've certainly seen in the last 3 or 4 years, there's some very good projects, and Peter Gagan is down the back there. He runs a co-op in Scotland called The Ferret, and it's an entirely subscription-based community model because it's a co-op, it's a not-for-profit, and again, the core philosophy is, can we get enough revenue? And in terms, that's subscribers, that's people paying every month, and you're building a relationship directly. You're meeting your subscribers every quarter, and you're telling them, here's what we're doing with your money. And here's the stories that we're generating as a result of this. I run a similar organisation in Ireland, a not-for-profit, that is about building community around access to information as a right. Stories do come from it, but also just the principle of fighting for access to information in a general way is something that needs to be done, and also helps the ecosystem of all other news organisations. And what's brilliant about, and this is the opportunity, I think, from, as well as the threats that come from platforms like Facebook and Twitter, the opportunity is there's also a direct line to the people who support what you're doing. And it's never been easier to take their money. Never been easier. You can encrypt your website with a certbot for free now. You can put a Stripe payment mechanism on your website for free as well, and you can start taking subscriptions straight away. This idea that you could, and I think the core philosophy as well is start small, don't take a salary, but eventually keep doing the work while you're doing other things. and then your side project becomes your main project.
George?
Whenever I hear anybody use the phrase build a community, I understand what's meant, but a little alarm sort of bzzz goes off in my head. And I think, okay, but what are you building the community for? It seems to me the next, or in fact possibly the more important question is, what value are you going to give that community? There is absolutely no hope for journalism if journalists go on doing a repeated activity, but in what is merely an adaptive way. It's digital, we need to build communities. We go on doing what journalists have always done, which has a basic value to it, but if you go on doing that by rote, it's just a process. You have to ask yourself all the time, what is the value that I am giving? And does the person that I'm giving it to understand the value is the same as I do? If you have a very large amount of information in the world, any economist will tell you that if you supply a large number of the goods, the price falls. Whenever you talk to anybody about the pricing of digital journalism, the level at which journalists have set the value is very, in fact, I think universally in my experience, above what the market will actually deal with, right? And that is just caused by the fact that supply and demand of information changes. So those things are more important. I'm not saying community is unimportant, but the next time somebody recommends that you build a community, the next question is, for what?
Just to build on that, I think one of the things that has become very clear over the last 20 years is that consumers of news don't differentiate between providers of news in the way that we think they did and that we wish they did. And that therefore, what we've got now in some ways is a significant oversupply of rather undifferentiated news, which all may be very high quality and professionally produced, but it's covering the same stories from the same perspective with more or less the same editorial tone. And that has been rather exposed by social distribution of news, in which audiences are often not particularly aware of the original sources of that news, and they certainly don't particularly actively go out of their way to choose some sources over others. So I think, to link to what George was saying, that sense of what is the particular role that me as an individual, my organisation, can provide in a broader news market. There's a set of questions there which news providers have not actually engaged with very systematically, and they're going to need to engage with them now to build those kinds of particular audiences around particular issues or agendas or perspectives that they believe they have something particularly unique to add to.
So I just wondered, Janine, because I think BuzzFeed's quite an interesting example in that they built an audience with the list and things we all became addicted to, and still read. They were copied by everyone. You went into journalism, you've done fantastic work. How do you stay ahead of the game as journalists and kind of try and predict what the next thing is and differentiate yourself when everyone starts imitating? How do you adapt in that?
Well, I mean, this is the interesting thing, because we're all presupposing that there is a crisis in the business model for journalism, and clearly there is a crisis in some of the business models for journalism, and clearly some subscription models work, although I'm yet to be convinced that anybody with a passion can start a successful subscription journalism business. And I think we do a disservice to young people when we suggest to them that if they care enough and work hard enough and take no salary and build up their audience, that everything will be okay. Because we that's a bit like saying if you just dream it, you can win the X Factor. I mean, some people can, but this is not a natural career. There is a business model for journalism. There are successful companies that are trading pretty solvently and doing quite well, thank you very much, with a wide audience and funding both entertainment, general interest content, and very, very serious news, and also everything in between. And you can fund that from advertising. Maybe not display advertising, but you can fund it through advertising. So you don't need to completely give up on every tenet that has ever existed. Some of those things still exist, and sometimes it's about how many markets you're in and how you cut your cloth and how you divide your resources and not doing the same stuff as everybody else. I would note, again, I mean, we are going to talk about business models because what we're talking about is professional journalists, not the acts of journalism, and what we're talking about is how do we pay our mortgage. The world of journalism is not undersupplied. We are spilling out of this room for a discussion about what's going to happen in 2030. Do people want to do this? It's a fundamental human act. I want to find something out and then I want to tell everyone. And I'd like as many people as possible to favourite it. That's a thing we're always going to want to do. The question is, if everybody wants to do it and everybody is able to do it, how do you find the good people and then reward them? There will always have to be a mixed economy to do it. And it will become more vocational because these things always do. And the reason old people like us are always so desperately depressed about it is because we remember the glory days when we only had to get out of bed, do one thing and just, get a salary.
Go to the bar.
It was great. And go to the pub, yeah.
I'm not depressed.
So, there's a question. Joe, at the back there, do you want to wave so you can get a mic at the back? Yeah, thank you. Then Renee, and then here at the front.
It's about, it is on. Excellent. You've made a call, a couple of you, about the types of things that are still going to exist in 2030. There are quite a few things that existed in the newsroom 13 years ago that don't exist now, including some jobs we would have called journalistic jobs. Go on, make a call. What are we going to get rid of in the next 13 years?
I mean, I would say that a lot of the tasks that don't exist, the tasks do exist. The job title, and I bemoan the copy takers because I miss being able to ring somebody up when you couldn't really write and go, oh, okay, this is what just happened at the see I was at. They were great. Oh, you young people, you'll never know the joy. They had to take your call.
And they corrected your English as
and
well.
they made it better. Well, then they would introduce some errors just for fun. A lot of those tasks are still there. We don't chip it out on stone, but we do write headlines and we do copy set and we do try and think of ways to produce data in graphs. A lot of the things do exist, even though we don't print it out on paper. Things that won't exist is, I don't think there'll be moderators. I think that's a thing that we'll look back on as a moment in time and go, oh, remember when we used to have moderators, those poor bastards.
Thankless task.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on.
Okay. Anyone else want to put...
Oh, what won't exist? I think it's hard to name maybe a particular job title. I think that the roles will evolve. To some extent, when Janine, and certainly when I was working in newsrooms, or in a particular newsroom 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the older staff used to talk about the glory days of drinking on lunchtimes and all that kind of thing. One thing that always struck me as a young journalist working in a newsroom at the time was what inefficiencies exist in newsrooms to allow that to happen. And I mean that in a business sense purely, is that there must have been an awful lot of money flowing through the system from the monopoly on access to advertising revenue in order for a kind of inefficiency, or the number of staff, say, just the raw staff count, to produce the product in question. So my question, I suppose to rephrase your question, is what inefficiencies currently exist, to put it in a business way, that we might not need, possibly? I don't know. I haven't worked in a newsroom like that for quite a long time. But I will say that in Storyful, in the early days, we had a very, very small team. So we had like 5-6 people. And 5-6 people in 2011 who had to try and find and verify video content from every Arab Spring country simultaneously in Arabic, when none of us spoke Arabic. But we still managed, using freely available tools, to try and manage that flow reasonably well, and we got better over time. That role did not exist kind of in any newsroom, particularly besides maybe the BBC and a couple of others. But if I was to think about newsrooms, I think it's really a question of what will machines do that will they replace, and then will the people in question adapt their skill set or upskill into the areas where they are needed, where human capacity is needed. So that's kind of my vague answer.
Mark, do you have a precise answer?
I have got a precise answer, yeah. It might be a slightly unpopular one. I think there will be many fewer political journalists than there are today. And I don't say that because I particularly welcome it or I think political journalism isn't important. But there are more people reporting on institutions that not enough consumers care about for the market to bear it. And I think there will be an inevitable shakeout in political journalism over the next 13 years.
George, anything to add? Or?
I think there are going to be many fewer sports journalists.
Because of automation?
There is some role for writing about the drama of sport that you can't convey audiovisually, but I think that's going to shrink. And, I mean, robots are already doing sports results. That's pretty well gone already.
Okay, there's a question from Rene Cap over there. Can we get him?
Thank you. Mr. Brock, I think, said technology in a few years' time would enable us to see and hear everything by ourselves. But I wonder if, faced with such a big amount of information, don't we need someone to tell us what to look at? So a kind of human filter in two senses, perhaps. One sense of verifying if a piece of information is valid, and also in the sense of trying to figure out the significance of that piece of information. Human filters instead of algorithm, a computer telling me what to believe in or what to trust. Don't we need someone? So perhaps the role of the journalists would transform from news gathering to news filtering? Thank you.
Let me make it clear that I'm strongly in favor of human beings, and I do not think that they are going to be replaced by machines in journalism, and come to that in many other areas of life. All I have argued elsewhere is that journalism takes place as an activity in a new information world, information rich. We're in the business of the management of abundance. Journalism began with the management of scarcity. I think there are four roles, I'll describe them very quickly, which I think are done by people who are trained, practiced, experienced. One is verification. I need not add much more there. One is what I would call sense-making, which is everything from analysis to opinion to context to background. One is eyewitness. Third is eyewitness, and the last is investigative journalism, by which I mean the specialist business of dragging facts out of places that don't want to disclose them. So yes, I do think there are core tasks that are journalism and must be done by humans. It's extremely difficult to do any of those things that I've described by robots.
Okay, we have a question down here. Just wait for the mic if you don't mind.
One of you mentioned the proposed law in Germany and described it in very negative terms as being bad. One of you mentioned the law in Germany and described it in negative terms as a form of government control. But if at the moment we have a situation where if I publish in a newspaper that you're running a child pornography ring out of a pizzeria, I'll be sued for libel and defamation and could face penalties for that. We have a situation in social media where anyone can say anything about anybody and there are no consequences at all. That is clearly not a sustainable situation over the long term. And so if the law in Germany isn't right, what way do we have for disciplining a media that has gone completely out of control? And the traditional barrier that places like Facebook or Twitter have maintained, we're just a platform, we're not a publisher, that seems unsustainable over the long term. So what's the future of that?
Yeah, so my concern about the German law is not so much about government control of information. My concern about the German law is that it delegates the responsibility for deciding what's legal or illegal to private organisations without necessarily any transparency about how they'll implement that requirement. I would be more interested in a legal approach that said, yes, digital platforms have a responsibility for managing the dissemination of harmful and illegal material on their platforms. They will be exempt from liability for the sorts of content that you're talking about if they can demonstrate that they have appropriate policies in place for managing that flow of information, and if they disclose what they've done to implement those policies, and they allow independent verification of the way that those policies have been implemented. So the responsibility on the platforms is a responsibility of process and of effective policy, rather than this very blunt tool of, you know, you must take content down in 24 hours or it's a €50 million fine. So I'm not saying there's not another way of tackling that problem, but I think that the particular way that it's been implemented and the attempt to give content obligations to organisations that are processing these vast volumes of content is probably not a very effective way of doing it.
But isn't that voluntary and without teeth, what you're describing?
No, because I think the teeth there is that if the policies that they had in place were not appropriate and didn't meet the tests of effectiveness that the government might put in place, then there would be liability associated with that. So if illegal content is disseminated on your platform and you don't have policies that meet the required standards in place, you would be liable in the way that you're describing.
Thank you. So we had a question here, third row.
Ready?
No, here. No. Thank you. And should we take two at a time? So after Renee, the back over there, the lady there. Yeah, thank you.
So you've talked a bit about, will there be journalists in 2030? Will there be journalism in 2030? It seems like you agree that there'll be content in 2030. I'm wondering what you think about the fate of news brands in 2030.
Good question. Shall we take that and then the other question?
I think it's a really good question. Because you could sort of think about the organisations that create news, and some of them are publicly funded or funded by donors or big philanthropists, and then the publications, and then the people that are committing acts of content, however they are aggregated or employed or paid. Some organisations, you know, the BBC is not going to pile through the licence fee in the next 13 years. It might get reduced, they might have a crisis of something with the government, probably they will do both of those things, but it will still be there. So the BBC will have some journalists who will be paid something. And around that, something like ProPublica will exist, probably something like the New York Times. Those things that employ a big mass of journalists are not going to be gone in the next 13 years. I think the number of publications, the number of places that you can go and consume content is going to grow massively, and we won't necessarily know what they all are. The idea that there will be 5 big news brands or 10... I used to think there would only be 5 big news brands, and I no longer think that. I think there will be 250 slightly nameless places that we go that will regularly get pointed to using auto magic. Something I don't understand yet, and then an infinite number of people committing the acts of journalism. So it is going to look like a pyramid. And the only way for proper journalism to survive, the proper, rich, deep stuff, is if everybody works together in an ecosystem. These things are not going to be able to separate out and fight and try and sue each other into oblivion. They're all going to have to work together within the pyramid in order to hold the pyramid up. There.
I agree. I think there's going to be a multiplication of opportunity for building small niche published publications that focus on specific areas and build their own business models. And I think that necessarily doesn't threaten the larger multinational publications. I think they'll exist as well. I think there might be a mid-level where there's either poor management or things are inefficient or not working that might disappear. But in the large, I could imagine the larger brands still existing and then a multiplication of new brands in the next 13 years.
Okay, there's a question over there. The lady there with the headphones, thank you.
Italiano, mi spiace perché il mio inglese non è dei migliori. Allora, io ho notato... Grazie. Ho notato che stiamo vivendo un momento appunto di eccesso di quantità di informazioni, ma la qualità delle informazioni non è un granché. Abbiamo tante informazioni tutte uguali, molto simili, copiate e incollate, e c'è proprio bisogno di specialisti delle informazioni. Io per esempio sono un avvocato, mi occupo di digitale e scrivo spesso, e quando esce una sentenza faccio dei commenti che sono un pochino più approfonditi di quello che è la notizia pura. Ecco, quello che vorrei capire è se nel futuro si pensa di gestire questo tipo di professionismo anche nel giornalismo, cioè fare giornalismo con persone che fanno anche un altro mestiere e che quindi riescono a dare magari un contributo aggiuntivo interessante, una specializzazione in più. Grazie.
Did everyone get the translation, or was it just for us? Okay, so the question was, we're in an age of excessive information. A lot of the information is very similar, but we do need specialists. The person who asked the question is a lawyer, so she comments in much more detail on some of the things she sees. So can we have journalism with people who have these specialisms in the future?
One of the ways in which I think journalism is going to evolve is that there will be more specialist contributions to some extent, and there will certainly be more niche sites, going back just to the last question as well, although I think the big brands will probably survive. Because it is easier to integrate. Journalism is more porous than it was, and therefore specialist knowledge should be easier to, it should be easier to use. Why not? And if it's good, then so much the better. Sorry. While I've got the microphone, can I just deal with something that was said a moment ago? Excuse me, sir, you said just now there were no consequences to somebody who did something on social media. I can only talk for the United Kingdom and the EU, and I can't speak to the situation in the United States. But if you say something on social media, and it is published and it is consumable in the UK, you can be sued. And people are. There is a thing also called the right to be forgotten. It operates in every EU state. You can apply to Google to have links broken to references to you. And if you don't like Google's decision, if you have the time and the patience and the money, you can take them to court. And people do. So the idea that there's no comeback to anything you do on social media is a fantasy.
Well, you had the good fortune of missing out on the American elections for the last few months before that, so you're living in a different information world than I have been.
Lucky me.
So the mic was back over there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Taken for granted that there will be some journalists around by 2030, and I can suppose that some of them can be found in this room. Some will be at BBC, for example. Do you think that it is possible to predict that if we want to have some journalists around in 2030, we should start from now to educate the public about the value of information? So it will depend on us, on journalists of today, if we will have journalists by 2030 or not?
Well, I said in my opening that I think journalists should worry and act not just about the value of information, but about what people consider to be true and the safe space for it. In the Enlightenment, people broke the monopoly of truth that was held by monarchies and the church. There was then a discussion and debate, which you could say lasted until now, about the cultural, legal, social changes that provide a space in which people can agree what is true. They may dispute it, but there will be some agreement, some basic agreement about what is truth. And that involves a whole lot of very complex factors, some of which go well beyond the strict limits of journalism. The point I was trying to make is, yes, of course journalists should think about and educate about the value of information, but I think it needs to go a bit wider, because if all journalists are doing is talking to each other and their students about the value of information, and the rest of the world doesn't care, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. There's been quite a lot of discussion today in the sessions that I've been in and in the trade press over the last few weeks about this idea of how can we inject quality back into the economic model for news. As has been quite rightly observed, it has been hard, particularly in distributed news environments, to differentiate quality providers. You can act on that on the demand side by getting people to value quality more highly and getting them to seek out providers who are higher quality and more trustworthy, and that's clearly very important, but I think will be a long and painful and slow journey. You can also act on the supply side by trying to get the economics of quality news to work better. And this is the area that Jeff Jarvis has been working on. There are various projects looking at how you might try to codify quality. For me, I think that's really important work, and I think the question of if there were signals of quality that advertisers, platforms, consumers, policymakers could act on, that will make a difference in the ability to sustain the business model for news, and that's not a substitute for the demand side focus, but it is I think going to be a really important part of the story over the next few years.
Thank you. There's a question. Oh, sorry, you've got the mic, and then over there. Thank you.
Yes, work now. Good evening. About journalism in the year 2030, a provocative guess. There will be journalism, there will be journalists, but the majority of us will be directly or indirectly employees of Facebook and Google. Is that a risk?
Wow, who wants to take that one?
On some level, aren't we already? Yeah. I feel like we all are. For a while, people thought that BuzzFeed was a sort of indirect subsidiary of Facebook. So I feel reasonably familiar with this proposition. But everything ebbs and flows. 13 years is a really long time to predict that even, what did you call it earlier? The Great Big Blue?
The Great Big Blue.
The Great Big Blue. Even the Great Big Blue will still be the most powerful thing. It only takes one very enthusiastic European Monopolies and Merger Commission, and they're all sort of broken up again. The need to tell stories and then the need to pass them on and share them and read them and circulate them is a bit more primal than the platforms. So I think there will be more than two employers of journalists.
We have some very optimistic journalists here today. There's a question there, like 3 rows in front.
How many rows can she go? Sorry.
Hi, Jasper Jackson from The Guardian. We're talking about the future and whether journalism will still exist in 2030, and obviously the people who employ journalists now are media companies that have often been around for a very, very long period of time. And if I look, I write about these media companies, and a lot of the time, a very large proportion of them don't seem to be behaving in a way that, for instance, creates trust in them, that gives a safe space to debate the truth, or often financially that is looking at the long term. They seem very short-termist. How do we encourage the current custodians of journalism, the media companies, newspapers, etc., to take a long-term view, to make the changes that need to be done to ensure there are still journalists and journalism in 2030?
Empower the younger generation.
It's the answer to everything, I think.
Such a crowd-pleasing
Quite right, too.
Not only 200-year-old organisations employ journalists. Some 200-year-old organisations still employ journalists, and that's great. The ones that are on the stock market have terrible troubles and get smaller and smaller every year. The ones that are privately owned have terrible troubles because they have to keep cutting to maintain the margins. It's some form of consolidation is probably the thing, isn't it?
I think I just say to the people who maybe work in those older organizations who feel that they exist out of entitlement, or that they deserve their place, they don't. They have to build businesses, that the businesses have to at least break even, because maybe some are just not for profits, they just want to break even so they can pay the mortgages, and maybe some are for profits. But journalists, particularly the younger journalists in the room, have to think about building businesses, I think.
So we have time for one last question. Gentleman over there.
Hello. One of the things that I've noticed, I've been covering technology for a long time, and I've noticed that there has been a lionisation of new technology. Social media has been lionised by the rest of the media, and in many senses, only in the last year or so that I've heard the other side of the story coming from the mainstream media. I don't think journalists have any future unless they're prepared to promote themselves. We should be telling the world what journalists do and why journalists is superior to the automation or whatever it is. We are the professionals at verifying information and putting it out to the public. Let us tell the world about that and maybe lionize ourselves a little bit.
I really agree very much with transparency and process. It's something I've certainly practiced for a long time in terms of telling my audience exactly how I came to certain conclusions in an investigation, for example, by sharing original documents or original data and saying what conclusions I reached. The problem with saying that, and I agree with your thesis, the problem is the amount of information is increasing and the number of journalists are decreasing. So automation has to reach some level of this equation. That doesn't mean we're removing humans entirely from the equation. I just think humans might be slightly further down the chain and the machines are doing some of the heavy lifting more so than they are now.
So don't you think the thing where we lionize ourselves is probably why they hate us? I mean, I don't know, but
I spend a lot of my time, I think, telling people about the value of journalism, but I do think that when we do it, we need to be very, very careful that the people we're talking to understand that value. And I don't think we have always done that terribly well.
And on that note, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for coming. It's really warm. Thank you for bearing with it.
I think it's time to do it.
And thank you to Mark, George, Janine, and Gavin.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you, Natalie. Very well done.
Thank you, guys.
God, that was honestly, I thought about halfway through we were going to
It's
pass
so hot.
out.
I'll pass out.
And I'm going to quickly say 3 things that I think are important to the entrenching that I would like to see. I think journalists are going to have to think much, much wider than journalism about the rebuilding of civil societies. I said a little bit about this in this room, not as a member of a panel this morning, but the space, creating and keeping safe the space for agreeing what is true, is not just a business of journalism, although it is very important to journalists, and journalists can contribute to it. It's a social, cultural, legal, institutional thing. And I think it's a really, really big task. Second point, I think some humility about the value of journalism is a very good idea. If people are now dealing with, in their daily lives, 4, 5, 20, 30 times more information than they would have had 20 years ago, the perceived value of all information is bound to fall. Get over it. It's just a new condition of life. And the third thing I would recommend is agility. In the late 20th century, we had a period in journalism in which
regulation of platforms at the Oxford Internet Institute, is that right? Does some consulting and has long experience as doing strategy for the BBC, Ofcom, and others. So, before we start, I thought I'd just work out how many people in the room think there will be journalists in 2030. Just show your hands. Quite optimistic. How many think there won't be any? I'm talking professional journalists. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, not many. Let's see if we can change your minds after this. Okay. So, we are going to talk about the profession of journalism and not business models, but I'm going to let George start because this was his idea. So he has a few things to say.
Do I need to press something here? Yeah, I do. Thank you. I think I'm the oldest, in fact, I'm certain I'm the oldest member of this panel, so I've actually posed a question about 2030 that I may very well not be around to see the answer to on schedule. In the context of Trump and Brexit and the kind of bounce that has given people whose subscribers' numbers are going up, the New York Times, for example, and so on, we might be tempted to think that journalism is going to be now, as a result of this, okay. It just struck me.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm sure you're all dreaming of a lovely cocktail by now, and your brains are probably buzzing with all the great presentations you've seen earlier. So thank you very much. Just very briefly, my name is Natalie Milinovic. I work at the BBC, and I'm involved in all things mobile. We have an incredible topic today, which is why you're all here, is, will there be journalists in 2030? And we have an absolutely brilliant panel to discuss this. There are no presentations. This will be a conversation despite this format. So I'll start with some brief introductions. We've got Gavin Sheridan here, who's the co-founder of Viz Legal, also has an NGO dedicated to FOI, and used to work at Storyful, and has done a lot of investigative journalism. Next, Janine, editor-in-chief, BuzzFeed, formerly from The Guardian and the woman who brought us the Snowden revelations. George, who is the mastermind behind this panel, whose idea it was, a professor of journalism at City University, and an illustrious career as a newspaper journalist and editor, mainly at the Times. And finally, Mark Bunting, who is currently looking at...
Income for print and terrestrial television was very solid and relatively assured. It convinced an entire generation of journalists, my generation roughly speaking, that all this would continue, it would roll forward on wheels indefinitely. That is historically complete nonsense. Every other era of journalism has been improvisational, volatile, risky, and littered with the wrecks of projects that don't work. So we have to get used to threats coming at us. It might be artificial intelligence, it might be virtual reality, it might be ad blockers, it might be anything. They will come at us in a regular stream. Get over it. We have to be more sensitive about connecting supply to demand, more sensitive and adaptable. And I think we have to be better at showing the origins of what we do. One of the problems about digital, it's come up in many, many panels here, is that it's very difficult to see the true origins of the information on which you are relying. I'm involved in a project called Inject, ask me if you're interested, which allows reporters to do that rather better. Those are my three in the run-up to this conference, that actually the problem of disintermediation, remember that? The problem of disintermediation hasn't actually gone away. And I've always asked myself whether the historians of 2030, or maybe better, 2130, will say to each other, wasn't it odd? In 2017, they had a separate professional class whose self-appointed job was to tell people about what they couldn't see and hear with their own eyes and ears. Wasn't that weird? Because it could be a real question in the future. And I'm not going to say, we can only hope, nor am I going to start a debate about the business models for journalism, because I have lived through too many of those. I want to ask a different question. What is it that journalists have to do to entrench the belief in the value of journalism and what they do? I think that's the key to the survival of the idea of journalism. I think it will be around as an idea in 2030. I think there will be journalists in 2030, but I can understand anybody asking